Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much to everyone, and let me welcome you on behalf of, I'm the director of the CEPR Network on Central Bank Communication, and we've put this together at this wonderful CEBRA conference. And I want to thank all our speakers, and we'll do that as we go through. There's 3 papers with discussants, so we're going to have 40 minutes per paper. The presenters will present for around 20 minutes, the discussants for around 10, and then whatever's left of the 40 minutes we'll keep over for discussion. And if there are questions that come in through the chat, you know, I will put them, or the Q&A function. We will put them to the speakers in the discussion part, unless there's any sort of major clarifications that I notice, and I may interrupt, but otherwise I'm going to sort of give speakers a free run, which I think just works better in these Zoom days. Okay, without further ado, let me kick things off. Lena is going to start us presenting on the hidden heterogeneity of inflation and interest rate expectations. Lena, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much for putting together this great session and including our paper in the program. So I'm very happy to present our joint work with Michael Lamla and Damjan Pfajfar. And since Damjan is at the Federal Reserve Board, the usual disclaimer applies. So let me jump in straight away. What we know from the previous literature on household macroeconomic expectations, mainly inflation expectations, is that there exists this very large degree of heterogeneity in level expectations across different types of sociodemographic characteristics. And we also know that on average, households tend to overestimate inflation in recent decades. We also know that at least in some countries, in some time periods, there is evidence that macro expectations of households matter for individual economic decision-making. And of course, central banks increasingly nowadays try to target also expectations of the general public. So that's also an important issue. What we want to do in this paper, given this degree of heterogeneity, which we observe, and the fact that people tend to overestimate inflation, we want to find out about consumers' macroeconomic preferences. We do that within a new survey run by the Bundesbank called the Online Pilot Survey on Consumer Expectations, where we ask participants whether they think the level of inflation and interest rates they expect will be appropriate, or whether they think it's will be too high or too low. So basically, we want to find out if somebody expects 5% inflation, does she think that's going to be a problem? Or would she prefer higher or lower inflation, or does she think that level of inflation is appropriate for the economy? And what we show is that there exists a really large degree of heterogeneity in these preferences, even for the same level of expectation. And that's what we dub the hidden heterogeneity. So there's this additional layer of heterogeneity in expectations coming from these preferences, and that's true also when level expectations are close to the ECB's target. We also show that in addition to the effect of level expectations on durable spending or saving decisions of household, preferences can also play a role. So they also matter for economic choices of households. So we ask ourselves, well, what determines these preferences? And first of all, we check whether they co-vary with level expectations. And indeed, there is a consistent variation with level expectations in the sense that consumers expecting higher inflation, for instance, also are more likely to think that inflation will be too high or that lower inflation would be preferable. But independent of that variation, when we look at consumers with very similar degree level expectations or controlling for individual expectations, there's still a lot of sociodemographic heterogeneity, which is not due to level expectations. And this type of variation is reminiscent of known variation in terms of individual risk preferences. And actually, we can show for inflation preferences that indeed there is a relation to individual risk preferences. so that more risk-averse consumers are also more likely to state that inflation should be lower and vice versa. So overall, we argue that our results are important for the efficiency of monetary policy transmission, because preferences can have an additional effect, or there can be an additional channel via which monetary policy shocks could transmit to consumers' spending or saving decisions. And of course, they matter also for central bank communication, in the sense that it's not sufficient to convince households that they should expect a certain level of inflation, but you also have to convince them that this is the appropriate level of inflation for the economy. So ultimately, we could use our measure to add a new dimension for the definition of anchored expectations. So let me tell you a bit about the data that we're using. As I said, this comes from the Bundesbank online pilot survey on consumer expectation. This has been running more frequently since 2019, and we were able to contribute our questions in the first two waves in 2019, so in April and May, and then again in wave 6 in 2020, that was May 2020. So we could re-ask our questions, and we ran a couple of robustness checks in that later wave in 2020. But today, most of our results will focus on those first two waves from 2019. Between waves, there's usually a rotating panel dimension. So we typically have about 2,000 observations per wave, and then half of those are re-interviewed in the next month. So 1,000 observations in consecutive waves. The core questionnaire, which we also use, asks about a wide range of consumers' macroeconomic expectations. It also asks about housing market expectations and housing choices. And then luckily, we have information on both actual spending and saving choices from the previous month, measured in euros, as well as qualitatively measured planned spending in the next 12 months. And we use that for our Euler type equations where we add preferences. And then, of course, socio-demographic characteristics are always controlled for. So these are the two main questions which we add. They are always asked after the level expectation question. So in this case, after inflation expectations are measured, then we ask, do you think the average level of inflation you expect for the next 12 months will be more or less appropriate, or do you think a higher or lower inflation rate would be better? And then we have these three options that respondents can choose from. In our robustness check in 2020, we also specified two versions of this question, where the first one asks consumers specifically to think about their personal situation, and the other type asks them to think about the economy in general. And we also in some cases ask both, so that we can check regarding this first version whether people were thinking about the economy or more about their personal situation. Turns out that for inflation, this doesn't seem to make a big difference, but for interest rates, it makes a rather large difference whether people are prompted to think about their personal situation. Basically, everybody would prefer higher interest rates, but this is slightly lower when we ask them specifically to think about the economy in general. So for interest rates, the question is more or less exactly the same. This is asked after the question about interest rate expectations. In the survey, we have both saving and mortgage rate expectations. And here we were more general in our question. So we just refer to the average level of interest rates that you expect for the next 12 months, and whether this will be more or less appropriate, or whether people would prefer a higher or lower interest rate. Okay, so let me show you some summary statistics from those first two waves in 2019. And here we just see the share of answers in each of those three preference categories for expected interest rates and expected inflation. So you see that the majority of respondents in our sample would prefer higher interest rates and lower inflation, 43% here. And we also have quite a large share of around 29% who would prefer higher interest rates and who think expected inflation will be reasonable. So there's this preference overall for higher interest rates and lower inflation. Now, of course, we're interested in checking whether this co-moves with the level of expectations. That's the first thing we analyze. So that's what we see here. We have quantitative expectations for inflation in the first column. Then we have expectations for savings interest rates in the second column and for mortgage interest rates in the third column. And we explain those with a large set of demographic controls and dummy variables for those preferring lower inflation or higher inflation. So those thinking it will be reasonable is the reference category, and the same for interest rates. And what we see is for inflation expectations that those preferring lower inflation are also more likely to give higher inflation forecasts compared to the reference group, and the reverse is true for those preferring higher inflation. Interestingly, there's also an interconnection between macroeconomic preferences in the sense that preferences for lower interest rates are also correlated with higher inflation forecasts. And then the same is true for the interest rate expectations. Here depends on which forecast we look at, which category is significant, but the sign is always consistent. So for instance, for savings interest rate forecasts, those who would prefer higher interest rates give lower forecasts compared to the reference group. And for mortgage rates, those preferring lower interest rates give higher forecasts. And again, there's also a correlation with inflation preferences. So on average, what we would expect is in the data preferences relate consistently to level expectations. However, when we then look at preferences across the range of expectations, and this is of course just a subset here, the range is much larger, but here we just plot inflation expectations between -2 and +10. And then across these ranges, we plot the smooth shares of answer categories of inflation preferences. So the solid line down here is the share of respondents preferring higher inflation. Then we have the dashed line of the share thinking inflation will be reasonable, and the dotted line is the share preferring lower inflation. And the first result I want you to take away is that, of course, these shares vary over the level of expectations, but if we just pick one level, pretty much regardless of whether that's deflation expectations or very high expectations, we always have a significant degree of heterogeneity in preferences. So the shares preferring either higher or lower inflation or thinking it will be reasonable, you know, there can be a dominant share, but you always also have other people with different preferences. So if we just take a look at the inflation target, this was before yesterday's press conference. So we defined the inflation target at 1.9%. That's the vertical line here. And at this share, we have around 50% of respondents with this level expectation, thinking that inflation will be reasonable. But we actually have a larger share thinking lower inflation would be better. And we also have a rather small share preferring higher inflation. And interestingly, if we look at people with deflation expectations, we still observe this very high share, around 30% of respondents who would prefer even lower inflation rates. So there's a really strong preference for very low inflation in the data set. Now, if we do the same exercise for interest rate expectations, again, the picture looks different. So we don't have this area where the biggest majority would prefer lower rates like we did for inflation. The shares evolve a bit more linearly, but still for any given level of interest rate expectations, we see this rather high degree of heterogeneity in preferences. So given this result that we have this large degree even of heterogeneity preferences, even at the same level of expectations, we were wondering whether that could be an additional channel via which monetary policy could transmit to economic choices of households. So what we did next was we estimate kind of extended Euler equation models where we regress the actual spending on, in this case, durable goods in the previous month in logs, on the qualitative measure of expected spending, and on a measure which we call the perceived real rate, which is the difference between individual nominal interest rate expectations and individual inflation expectations. So those are the two variables which it would typically include in an Euler equation. And then we add again the dummy variables for our preference measures, and in an extension also estimate interaction effects with the perceived real rate. And of course, always we control for demographics. So let's first take a look at the full sample. That's the first 4 columns you can see here. And here we see that there, in some models, there's some evidence for consumption smoothing, in the sense that there's a positive correlation between current and planned spending. We find no significant effect of the perceived real rate, but we do find some significant effects of those preferring lower interest rate. And actually, this positive coefficient could be interpreted in a way that these households who would prefer lower interest rates behave as if nominal interest rates were already lower, because then we would expect higher current spending on durable goods. And next, we zoom in on those with rather accurate inflation expectations close to the official target, so between 1.5 and 2%. And in this sample, there's more evidence of a significant negative intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So we have in most models this negative correlation between the perceived real rate and current spending. And the effect from people preferring lower interest rates compared to the reference group remains, at least in this model here. And in the extension with interaction effects, interestingly, we find that these people also react more strongly to their perceived real rate. So the intertemporal elasticity that we estimate is larger. And then we also have some evidence which is not as significant from those preferring higher inflation. So overall, even though perhaps not every effect is as we would expect it from the theory, there seems to be some evidence that these preferences can play a role for spending decisions on top of the level expectations, which we also account for.
Lena, just to let you know, you've got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
All right. Okay, so after that, we want to dig a bit deeper into finding out what drives these preferences. And I'm going to spare you the details, but this rather large table here just shows regression results for each preference category on the set of demographic characteristics. So we have gender, age, income groups, a dummy for having lived in the eastern part of Germany before reunification, education and employment, and a dummy for owning a house. And as you can see in the full sample, there's a lot of demographic variation happening for these preferences. And as we zoom in on inflation expectation, in many cases, these effects become even stronger. And even if we account for level expectations directly in our estimations, except for the effect of income, all the other sociodemographic variations and preferences remain. So there seems to be variation happening which is not related to level expectations. And the same is true also for interest rate expectations. Now, since I'm running out of time. I'm not going to explain it in a lot of detail, but this variation which we find is very reminiscent of known variation in risk preferences. So we wanted to check that directly, and luckily we were able to do so with our new data from 2020, since risk preferences were included in the wave before that. So we can connect these for the sample participating in both waves. And here you see the results for inflation preferences. And if you look at the full sample, we see that in a model with no controls, but also including a large set of demographic controls, or accounting for level expectations of inflation and interest rate, we always find that there is a negative correlation between the measure of risk preferences. So this asks about how willing are you to take any risk in general? So this is a very standard question. And the likelihood of stating inflation should be lower. And you should interpret this negative coefficient in the sense that people which give a very low rating on the risk measure, so they're not willing to take a lot of risk in general, they're also more likely to state that inflation should be lower. And this remains when we restrict the sample on those with expectations close to target. And then we also have this positive effect here on the likelihood of stating inflation will be appropriate. This is not the case for interest rate expectations. So there we find no significant relation to risk preferences. So let me very briefly wrap up here. As I showed you, we investigate the role of macroeconomic preferences for spending decisions and also the relationship to risk preferences. And we show that there's a huge degree of heterogeneity, even at the same level of expectations, and that this relates to durable spending decisions, but not just that. We also find, for instance, that households who think that inflation should be lower save less, but I didn't have time to show you these results today. In the case of inflation preferences, we can show that the socio-demographic variation which we find relates to individual risk preferences. So overall, we think that these results give some interesting insights for additional channels for the transmission of monetary policy, and they could be important for the efficiency of central bank communication. And in the future, we are hoping to be able to ask our questions again in the current year later on, so that we could test how these preferences change in a new regime, since we have inflation rates temporarily above target in Germany currently. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lena. We're going to hand over straight away to our discussant, who's Philippe Andrade, who is joining us from Boston.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you see? Okay. Can you see everything? Okay, good. So thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me to discuss this paper. And let me start by saying that the usual disclaimer applies. So it's a very interesting paper. Okay, so what the author do, they have new questions in a new survey of households. That survey is the survey that has been developed by the Bundesbank. I guess Emanuel was instrumental in that. So thank you for doing this. That's good. It's going to be used by many researchers. And so they have these two questions in addition to the standard, quantitative measures of households expecting inflation or interest rates. We also have some qualitative questions as to whether people think that the level of inflation that they expect is appropriate or not, and if not, whether they expect that they would like that it should be lower or higher. And they have the same for interest rates. Okay? The first thing that they have is a very striking result. Okay, so this is the first level, the descriptive statistical. I thought it was really striking to see that most of the people, the vast majority of the people that are surveyed, don't think that the level of inflation they expect and the level of interest rate that they expect is appropriate. Actually, they would prefer the interest rate to be higher, and they would prefer the expected inflation to be lower. Okay, so basically, the majority would prefer to have higher real interest rates than what they expect. Okay, and so I could not resist to show you a more striking or provocative version of this table, which is, this cover by the newspaper Bild, showing Draghi as Count Dragila, who, sucked the savings of an household because of ultra-low interest rates policy. So this was disappeared in September 2019, a little bit, a few months before Draghi left the ECB. Okay, so this is I think very, very striking. But they also have some more subtle results and also very interesting results. First of all, you have this what they emphasize as the hidden heterogeneity of inflation expectations. They also have something on interest rates expectation, but I'm going to focus more on inflation expectation in the discussion. So they compare households with the same expected inflation, and then they show that some consider that inflation, even though they expect the same level, or the same quantitative level for inflation expectation, some consider that inflation is too low, some consider that it is too high. Then they can relate these differences of opinion to individual characteristics. Okay, so they show that age, risk aversion, out of labor force, the fact that you used to live in East Germany increase the probability to consider that inflation is too high, so to prefer a lower inflation rate, and home ownership or income on the decrease that probability. Okay. And also something that is interesting is that these differences in opinion matter for durable spending. Okay, and so here the result is that households considering interest rates should be lower will spend more. Okay, which is a bit. This is interesting. I'm going to discuss that. So let me jump to my comments. So first of all, you emphasize this hidden heterogeneity, but I wonder whether what you have is not a hidden homogeneity, okay, of inflation expectation. So basically, if you compare households with heterogeneous quantitative expectations about future inflation, say someone expecting 2% and someone expecting 5%, they can both agree on that inflation is going to be too high and that lower would be better. Okay, so as you said, Lena, you said, okay, so take a value for inflation expectation, you see that some people for the same value, some people think differently about that value. But now if you take one line, so say, take the fraction of people who think that inflation should be lower, you see that, this covers a very large range of potential quantitative inflation expectation, okay? So from -2 to 10%, you can still think that, inflation is too high or will be too high, okay? One of the reasons why I would like to emphasize this hidden homogeneity rather than hidden heterogeneity is that it's very much in line with something that we find in a related paper with Juan Goethe and Eric Mengus, where what we show is that not all of the heterogeneity in inflation expectation, in household inflation expectation matter. Okay, so let me just give you a very quickly a summary of what we find. So we find, as is documented in many surveys, on almost every survey of household expectation, that there's a large dispersion of household view about future inflation. But the key difference, is a difference between people who expect stable prices and people who expect a positive inflation level. Okay, so for instance, variation in the share of households who expect stable prices is going to account for 75% of the variance in average expected inflation over time. Okay? So it's a very important fraction of what makes the average inflation expectation across household vary over time. Second of all, and more importantly, households who expect stable prices tend to consume less durable than households who expect positive inflation. And this effect is not there if you compare households that we expect positive inflation. Okay, so the quantitative difference within households expecting positive inflation do not have an impact on the consumer on durable spending. Okay, and so as we emphasize in that paper, this mechanism has very important consequences for monetary policy. In particular, it flattens the Euler equation, and so it lowers the efficacy of monetary policy, promising future inflation, like for guidance or other inflation target. Okay, so here I think it's probably, I mean, maybe the two set of evidence are very much aligned or consistent together. And so maybe one question you could check is whether the difference in opinion that you observe correspond to differences in expected inflation regime. By that I mean, the fact that you expect stable prices or positive inflation. So that would be interesting to check. The second comment is about how you can, we should interpret that the answer that inflation should be lower. Okay, so you use this word preference, and I understand why, but somehow it could be a little bit misleading because there's several reasons why someone can answer that would like inflation to be lower. Okay, so first of all, it can be differences in opinion, and you can have the opinion that the monetary policy is not appropriate given the macroeconomic outlook. Okay, so and you expect less accommodation given the macroeconomic outlook. It's also something that can be generated by your risk exposure to inflation risk or to interest rate risk because of difference in the composition of your financial wealth. Okay, so people with more bonds and cash would prefer lower inflation because they are more exposed to inflation risks, and that's not the same for people with more debt and more stock holdings or higher stock holdings. And the last reason is really differences in opinion. Okay, and so you might have an interesting test for low inflation for several reasons, maybe due to your past inflation experience, as Malmendier and Nagel emphasized, or also for partisanships bias, like Quabion, Gornish, and Cohen-Weber recently emphasized. And I think here it would be nice to see whether the data that you have could be used to distinguish between these different reasons for that would lead to the same answer. And of course, it's important in terms of the policy reaction to these differences in opinions that you emphasize. The last comment that I have is on the impact on spending. So the result that you showed us is that households who answer that interest rates should be lower consume more, and this is something that has potentially very interesting policy implications. So of course you can phrase it the other way around. So households who consume less when they consider that interest rates should be higher. Okay. And one of the reasons is the standard argument that when interest rates are too low, you lower the income from savings, and so savers are going to consume less. And this is something that will limit the efficacy of low for long interest rate policy. Okay? And that's an argument that has been put forward by many, at least in the euro area. So saying that, low interest rates are hurting savers and therefore hurting demand. So here I think we should get rid of alternative explanations before really considering that you have a very important result. First, two potential alternative explanations are the following ones. So first, there might be reverse causality. So people who spend more on durables, maybe they are more indebted or they take more debt to do so. And so therefore they will prefer in the future lower interest rates, okay, if the rates on their debt is flexible. Another alternative explanation of your result is differences in individual characteristics. So you can think that richer households consume more on durables, but they also hold more stocks. And so maybe they prefer lower interest rates, okay. I don't know if you can, do some more analysis to reject this alternative explanation of your interesting results. So to conclude, I think, as I was just saying, it's a paper that provides interesting results using new household survey data and some specific design. In particular, so you show that households can have the same opinion about future inflation despite they have different quantitative inflation expectations. You also show that differences in opinion matter for spending decisions, and they matter more than quantitative difference in interest rates and inflation expectation. And again, as I was saying, this is very much consistent with what we show with Juan and Eric and what we obtain on other surveys. So it's, I like that. Of course, I have my views on that. And it would be very interesting to know more what drives the size and the channels which they have decisions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left for discussion. Lena, while you were presenting, a question came in, but it was one I felt I could answer on who the survey targeted. So I answered that it targeted the general public rather than bankers or business people. So I took that one. But I thought I would, if anybody who's attending but not in the Zoom screen right now has a question, put it in the Q&A function and I'll put it to Lena, or if you have questions for Philippe, I'm sure he would be happy to also answer. But I also thought I'd open it out to the other people on the panel if they had any. And if not, I stand ready as a questioner of last resort to step into the breach, because I have a bunch of them I'm happy to ask. Okay, well, I'll give people time. Oh, Emanuel.
I have a suggestion rather than a question. I mean, what really is emerging as an interesting follow-up research question here is whether instead of managing expectations, central banks actually can manage preferences. And it's not unreasonable to think that to some extent, at least some of the people surveyed in this survey are maybe prefer lower inflation because of communication by policymakers. It's at least it would be an interesting question to see if that's the case, or to put it sort of more bluntly, is the Bundesbank president a hawk because Germans like lower inflation, or the other way around? And I think this is something that potentially can be studied, and maybe Lena and I can discuss later how to do this. But I think this would be very interesting to see if there's sort of if you can manage preferences as a central bank.
Yeah, thanks, Emanuel. Dimi, I'll come to you in just a second. I just wanted to add on top of that what Emanuel said. It's actually one of the first things I wrote down, that more than being about the typical central bank communication channel, this sort of hidden layer that you seem to be talking about seems to focus more on what in my own earlier work, we looked at what we call the 3 E's, and one of them was education. So like some of this, really does seem to be, and I'm not sure, Emanuel, whether it's from central bankers or whether we should push this out to the education ministries of our various countries. But a lot of people, it's one of my big pet peeves, people leave school knowing how to calculate the volume of a sphere, all very useful to learn, and good intelligent stuff to get your brain thinking, but very few understand interest rates and inflation for stuff that they're all going to use in their life, like getting a mortgage. So there's definitely an education channel. Okay, Dimi, I'm coming to you in a moment, but there's 2 questions in the chat that I want to make sure our non-video present people get their voices heard. So Simon Sheng has one, which is to Lena. Do households understand the concept of inflation? Would different households interpret the same concept differently, perhaps? So I'm going to park that one with you. You can come back to that in a second. And the next one is, great presentation from Brent Meyer. Do you know anything about the demographic differences between those with lower inflation preferences versus people that had a preference for higher inflation? So I'll leave those 2, and then we'll, if you answer them. Actually, Dimi, why don't you ask your question as well, and then we'll let Lena have the last word.
Okay, it's a short one. I just wanted to know what would be the theoretical linkage between the willingness to take risk and the inflation preferences, because I was very puzzled about this result.
Okay, actually, I'll give a last one came in the chat from Carlos. In line with Philippe's questions, it would be interesting to compare results to those professional forecasters answering the same question, and that would probably help us in understanding, whether regular people prefer low inflation, for particular reasons. Okay, you have a whole bunch there to answer, and you've got about a minute to do it. So take an extra minute, and then I started a little late, so go ahead.
All right. So yes, thank you very much for those very interesting comments and questions. Obviously, I won't have time to answer all of them, but I'll be happy to do that in the chat later on. So that, just very quickly, managed preferences and education, Emanuel and Michael, I couldn't agree more. So definitely very interesting and important work still remains to be done. Regarding the concept of inflation, what Simon asked, we know that the general public has difficulties in understanding the general concept of inflation. This wasn't tested directly in this survey, but we do know that there's a lot of misconception around this. The survey tried to accommodate for some of that by asking different types of inflation expectation questions, which have been tested extensively in other surveys. But I think that still explains some of the large variation which we find, for instance, in level expectations. And of course, that relates back to the education argument. Regarding the differences between those preferring higher or lower inflation, we had to kind of rush through that. What we find is that this variation is actually pretty similar to the one that we typically find for level expectation, but it doesn't seem to be driven by level expectations. So for instance, those with lower education or lower income, they are more likely to prefer lower inflation than those with higher education income. There's also a gender bias. This kind of links to the last question regarding the theoretical link between risk and inflation preferences. Basically, for many people, inflation is a negative economic signal, and we have other papers showing that. So if you're very risk averse in general, you might view inflation as a negative thing, not just for the economy, but perhaps also for yourself personally. That's the idea, basically. So if you're very risk averse, and we should stress that the majority of those households in our sample at least give interest rate the preferences, suggesting that they are not heavily invested in stocks, but they would rather prefer higher interest rates to earn more on their savings. So then this might hurt your savings and your purchasing power. So that's why, if you're very risk averse, you might object to that more. And finally, the last point for professional forecasters, yes, that would be extremely interesting. And if anybody's listening in from the ECB survey of professional forecasters, we would, of course, be hugely interested in asking our questions there as well. So far, that's not something we have done.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Let me, on behalf of everyone, thank both Lena and Philippe for their great start to this session. Lena, I've left the questions in the Q&A if you want to type anything else or just say, answered live. Otherwise, let me hand immediately over to Emanuel, who's going to talk to us about would inflation households understand average inflation targeting, although of course we were told yesterday that the ECB is definitely absolutely not doing average inflation targeting. So I'll leave that hovering out there as a controversial thought.
I was going to talk about this anyways, but thanks for the introduction. Thanks for putting this paper on the program. This is joint work with Mathias, Hoffmann, Lora, Pavlova, and Guido Schultefrankenfeld, all from the Bundesbank Research Center. Lora is also a PhD student at Karlsruhe. And we're central bankers, so the usual disclaimer applies. This is very fresh work. Until very recently, this was only a set of slides, so I apologize to our discussant Dmitry for sending him something very preliminary, but we very much look forward to his comments and also other comments on our work. Now, major central banks review their strategies regularly. I see something on top of my screen, which is a little annoying. I don't know why that is. Sorry about this. Let me unshare and then share again. I see something.
Yeah, we could see it as well.
You could see it as well?
It's okay. Not there now, so.
Okay, now is it better now? Yeah, it's better for me. Okay, sorry about that. So central banks regularly review their strategies, and as part of the sort of strategic reviews, the management of inflation expectations plays a key role. And one example is the recent Federal Reserve System's monetary policy strategy review, which was completed in August of last year. And the Fed actually introduced for the first time as a makeup strategy, which seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. And the way Jerome Powell, J. Powell put it at his press conference was that he said, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting, which may imply that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. So an explicit overshooting that the Fed aims at after periods of low inflation. Now, just yesterday, the European Central Bank concluded its framework review. And while average inflation targeting was among the possible outcomes, the new price stability objective stops short somewhat of average inflation targeting. Instead, the Governing Council now considers that price stability is best maintained by aiming for a 2% inflation target over the medium term, and says that this target is symmetric, meaning that negative and positive deviations of inflation from the target are equally undesirable. This may also imply a transitory period in which inflation is moderately above target. So rather than committing to overshooting inflation above 2% after periods of lower than 2% inflation, the ECB would tolerate higher inflation. And of course, these may be subtle differences, but central bankers think they're very important. Christine Lagarde yesterday answered in the Q&A, are we doing average inflation targeting like the Fed? The answer is no, very squarely, because there are multiple ways to respond to this effective lower bound constraint. In any case, no matter of how you actually phrase such a strategy, all these different strategies rely on inflation expectations, or makeup strategies such as AIT rely on inflation expectations acting as an automatic stabilizer. And while that works well in theory, and we understand how these automatic stabilizer role of inflation expectation works in theory, there's very limited practical experience. There was a little bit of price level targeting in Sweden in the 1930s. And ever since, really, there's no major central bank that has engaged in such a policy. The Fed is really the only or the first central bank to adopt such a policy. So we still don't have any evidence or much evidence how such a strategy shift affects inflation expectations by households and other economic agents. There's one paper by Coibion and co-authors who find no clear evidence that the Fed's new monetary policy strategy made its way to the public. So it seems that individuals didn't really hear of the strategic shift of the Fed. And they also find that they observe that information on the average inflation targeting strategy does not significantly alter US households' inflation expectations. Now, what are we interested in this paper? We would like to understand whether German households understand average inflation targeting as a concept. And so we are asking a number of questions in our paper that we're trying to answer a number of questions related to this broader question. First, how do households' medium and longer term inflation expectations differ under alternative monetary policy strategies? Would inflation expectations adjust symmetrically with current inflation being above or below the target? And how does trust in the central bank impact inflation expectations under alternative monetary policy strategies? We are also interested in how households' readiness to spend would be affected, but I'm not going to have time today to talk about this. So what do? We run randomized control trials in the Bundesbank online panel households. So that's exactly the same survey that Lena was using in her paper. But since 2019, this has become a sort of a permanent effort. And so it's not a pilot survey anymore. The new name, the permanent name is the Bundesbank online panel households, but it's essentially the continuation of the pilot survey that Lena was using. We asked 9,000 respondents in 3 different waves: October 2020, January, and February 2021. And I will primarily report results based on the February 2021 wave, which had 5,000 respondents. We asked these respondents probabilistic expectations, or we solicited probabilistic expectations from these households for medium, so 2 to 3 year ahead, and longer run, 5 to 10 year ahead inflation, under 2 monetary policy strategies: the current inflation targeting strategies, or current until yesterday inflation targeting strategy of the ECB, and a hypothetical average inflation targeting strategy, which we formulated in exactly the way as Jay Powell has formulated the Fed's strategy in August 2020. And then under these sort of treatments, we study the effects of a hypothetical change in monetary policy strategy on inflation expectations. And we also do this asking respondents to take into consideration additional assumptions about the start year inflation, so the 2021 inflation rates. And specifically, we asked them to assume that inflation in 2021 would be either 1% or 3%. Okay, now let me briefly show you the setup of the RCT that we run. First, in the first stage, all participants in the survey see an info box that basically describes in layman's words the ECB's current strategy, which again, until yesterday, aimed at inflation rates close to but below 2% in the medium term. It also then provides some information on the Fed's alternative strategy, which aims to steer the inflation rate at 2% on average. And we also give them an example of what that means, namely that if inflation runs below the target, the Fed will raise inflation above the target for some time. At the second stage of the RCT, we ask all participants, assuming that the ECB is pursuing its current strategy of aiming at inflation close to but below 2% in the medium term, we ask all participants to assign probabilities for inflation 2 to 3 years ahead, being in one of 4 bins with a certain probability that they need to enter. And the bins are inflation being less or equal to 1%, greater than 1%, but at most 2%, between 2 and 3%, or greater than 3%. After this probabilistic inflation question, we then divide all the participants into 5 different groups. Group A is being presented an alternative strategy and is asked to assume now that the ECB, in contrast to its current practice, pursues an alternative strategy which aims at reaching 2% inflation on average. And then we also have 4 other groups where we additionally make assumptions about the start year inflation in 2021, and asking some to assume that the ECB pursues its current strategy, inflation rate close to but below 2% in the medium term, or the alternative strategy targeting average inflation to be 2%. And then again, we provide them with additional assumptions about the start year inflation. Now with that, we can ask the question and answer the question: how would households' medium and longer term inflation expectations behave under different monetary policy strategies? And so here in this chart, I compare the inflation expectations 2 to 3 years ahead, before and after this information treatment. And the blue bars show the probabilities, average probabilities assigned to the 4 bins under the assumption of the current strategy before the treatment. The green bars show the average probabilities assigned to the 4 bins under the alternative AIT type strategy. And what we clearly see is that the probability mass shifts to the right. There's fewer respondents who say inflation would be less or equal to 1%. There's fewer respondents who say that inflation would be in the 1 to 2% range. There are more respondents that think inflation would be between 2 and 3%, and slightly more that think inflation would be greater than 3%. So, and the differences between these are highly statistically significant. So under the assumption of an alternative strategy, respondents shift their inflation expectations upward in the medium term. We also then in February 2021 asked for the longer term inflation expectations of respondents, and we see a very similar pattern. So even in the longer term, 5 to 10 years out, there's a shift of inflation expectations to the right under the alternative strategy. So longer term inflation expectations also significantly move upward in assuming an alternative monetary policy strategy. Now, to what extent do mean inflation expectations vary with the monetary policy strategy? We can, of course, translate these bin responses into a continuous distribution, which we fit to individuals' probabilistic assessments to compute essentially a mean inflation expectation for each individual from the 4 bins. When we do this and show the distribution of mean inflation expectations across individuals for 2 to 3 years ahead inflation expectations on the left column and 5 to 10 year inflation expectations in the right column, again comparing the current close to but below 2% strategy and the alternative average 2% strategy, we see that mean inflation expectations both in the medium and the longer term shift to the right significantly under the alternative strategy. Now, a question that is natural to ask is whether households would adjust their inflation expectations symmetrically above or below the target. In the experiment, households receive information that if inflation runs below the target, the Fed will raise inflation above the target for some time. Jay Powell did not say that the opposite would be true, certainly on purpose. And so the question is whether households would interpret such an alternative strategy being communicated in this particular way as being symmetric around 2% or not. And so what we do is to answer this question, we ask randomly sampled group of respondents to report expected inflation 2 to 3 years ahead under different assumptions about 2021 inflation. And I already mentioned how this is done. Now, what we see is that under AIT, there's a stronger shift of expected inflation to above 2% when respondents are additionally asked to assume the 2021 inflation rate is at 1%. So basically, there's more of an overshooting under the alternative strategy when inflation in 2021, the starting inflation is assumed to be 1%. We also see that there's a stronger shift under AIT compared to the current strategy, inflation targeting strategy, of expected inflation to below 2% when respondents are asked to assume that 2021 inflation were 3%. But this effect is somewhat more muted and mainly shows up in the tails. And we can basically also assess quantitatively the differences. Here on the right, we see that the differences between the alternative strategy and current strategy, assuming that inflation 21 is 1%, are about 20 basis points or 18 basis points, depending on whether you look at individuals that adjust their inflation expectations after the treatment or not, and the significant assumption of starting inflation to be 3% results in a downward shift of expected inflation, but that's not statistically significant. Now, one question that is interesting to ask is whether trust in the central bank impacts inflation expectations under these alternative monetary policy strategies. And we can assess this question by explicitly asking respondents to what extent they trust the ECB's ability of achieving price stability. So in the February wave of 2021, we included a question where we asked exactly that, when people can choose between 0 and 10, where 0 refers to no trust at all, that the ECB has an ability to achieve price stability, and 10 full trust. And what we find is that the distribution of trust values is very reasonable, with the median being about 5. Very few people have 0 trust. Relatively few have a full trust, but the distribution is well behaved. We find that people with high trust adjust inflation expectations more strongly under the alternative compared to the current strategy. So it seems to be the case that individuals that have a higher trust in the ECB to achieve its price stability target actually respond more strongly to the alternative strategy. And we also find that they adjust inflation expectations more strongly from below target level than from above target levels of inflation. And this is summarized in this table here, where you basically, when looking at interacting the dummies for the different groups of treated individuals with different assumptions or pieces of information, interacting that with trust, we see that the differences between post and pre-treatment inflation expectations are particularly large and significant at the highest trust quantiles. And we also see that for those assuming the start year inflation is above target, the differences are now statistically significant, or there's a statistically significant undershooting expectations for the high trust individuals, but not for the low trust individuals. They still think that inflation will overshoot, even though start year inflation would be above the 2%. So that shows that basically the trust in the central bank's ability to achieve the price stability objective seems to play an important role in the effectiveness of such a strategy in managing inflation expectations. Now, as the final exercise that I will show you today, we're asking whether these differences in inflation expectations that we find, whether they're economically significant. And to do so, we do the following exercise. Well, first, let me reiterate that the benefits of an average inflation targeting strategy arise from stabilizing effects on inflation expectations. Under makeup strategies such as AIT, inflation expectations play a stabilization role in the sense that when inflation is below target, inflation expectations should automatically adjust upwards and hence lower the real rate and vice versa. Now, we have found in our survey experiment that inflation expectations seem to adjust to such a strategy in the desired way. But to what extent these differences in inflation expectations of 11 to 18 basis points that we reported are economically significant, we need a model. And so what we do here in this last part of the paper, which is brand new and wasn't in the version that we sent to Dimitri, we analyze the economic significance by comparing two model economies. In both economies, the expectations channel is mitigated through some borrowing lending constraints for a fraction of households and some backward-looking price setting for a fraction of firms. So to make sure that the expectations channel is not unduly strong in a fully rational, full information and no frictions economy. And then we, in this economy where the expectations channel is somewhat mitigated, we then compare two such economies where one has a central bank that follows an inflation targeting rule, and one where the central bank implements average inflation targeting. We then simulate both economies, starting at 1% below the inflation target. And we calibrate the difference of the 2 to 3 year ahead expected inflation to match our survey evidence. So to match sort of the about 15 basis points, give or take, difference in expected inflation 2 to 3 years out under the alternative relative to the current inflation targeting strategy. And what we then find based on these two simulated model economies is that inflation, so even this modest difference in expected inflation 2 to 3 years out in the economy where the central bank implements AIT, even this modest difference in inflation expectations makes inflation itself considerably less volatile. So inflation is 6 times less volatile under AIT than under inflation targeting. The volatility of output or output gaps is about the same. And the occurrence of 0B periods or episodes is essentially zero under this AIT, in this AIT economy, but is 4.5% in the inflation targeting economy. So we conclude from this that the economic significance of these differences in inflation expectations under the two alternative strategies is there. With that, let me conclude. It's well known that in theory that AIT or other makeup strategies can deliver superior outcomes in terms of welfare if agents understand it. But so far there's little evidence if economic agents do understand such makeup strategies and adjust inflation expectations according to theory. Now, our survey evidence suggests that households do actually adjust inflation expectations in line with theory. They have higher inflation expectations under a hypothetical average inflation targeting strategy. We also find that adjustment towards the inflation target from below and above the target. So a somewhat symmetric understanding of the AIT strategy, even though the latter effect is attenuated. And of course, that's to some extent expected because the communication is not necessarily symmetric, that the Fed has chosen and that we used here to treat the individuals. We also find that under AIT, individuals with higher trust in the ECB adjust inflation expectations more strongly than under IT. So a high trust in the central bank seems to be important for the management of inflation expectations under these alternative strategies. And theory suggests that the survey-based differences in mean inflation expectations that we observe is economically significant. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Dimitri, not all heroes wear capes, but I expect to see a full discussion of the model, even though you haven't seen it yet. So good luck with that. No, I'll hand over to you. You've got about 10 minutes. Thanks, Emanuel, for that. And Dimitri, you've about 10 minutes for your presentation. You're still on mute.
Sorry, I got lost in my computer screen because when I started sharing, immediately the button unmute disappeared, so I couldn't do anything about it. Okay, so I would disclose a secret. Emanuel and I already have exchanged a couple of emails because the paper was so interesting. I couldn't resist sending my slides to Emanuel, so we had some discussion. I had two versions of the paper, one without the model, one had some model, and I see that there has been further progress on the paper, so I'm very delighted that the paper is going on and being developed. One of the developments that I have noticed was that the word German from the title has disappeared. The first version was about German household, and Emanuel has mentioned German households. Now, I would say that I would prefer, I think I know a couple of German households. I don't see a big difference between us and them. And I think that probably the big contribution of the paper is in more than just studying the German market, but more talking about maybe some specifics of average average inflation targeting. There has been a surge in interest in how central bank policy communication affects expectations, but mainly the papers study how announcements of the current policy and more specifically announcement of the interest rate and maybe announcement of projected inflation affect inflation expectations and interest rate expectations of the public. In that sense, the paper differs because the paper says, okay, what about if the central bank announces, or if we announce for the central bank a shift in the policy and just a different target, but without announcing the current policy action? I think that's quite interesting and a useful study because, well, forward guidance for population, for general public is quite an important thing as well. So announcing the policy might play a big role. The main results are, as from the versions that I have read, and my reading of the main results was that expectations were well anchored just below 2% of inflation, and that there was overshooting of expectations with AIT compared to inflation rate targeting. And the one of the nicest results that I've now heard in the slides in the presentation is that the volatility of inflation is actually in simulation is much lower under average inflation targeting, which is a good message. As far as I know, and as far as the authors also acknowledge, there is only one paper by Quabione co-authors that studies a similar effect, and they do that with American household using Nielsen data, also a large number of observations, slightly different techniques, but the main finding by them is that the switch from inflation targeting to average inflation targeting has no effect on expectations. And in that sense, I found the results of the current paper, it's always good to see papers that show different results, but since my own research also with Michael together shows that it is very hard to shift expectations by making an announcement. And if it is so hard to shift expectations, even if you announce a very precise interest rate, policy rate, or even if you communicate to the public the inflation rate itself, why would it be possible to so nicely shift expectations in the desired direction by communicating the policy? I think that it, for households, it will be more difficult, or it should be more difficult for them to infer from the policy shift communication what the actual inflation rate will be. In that sense, I find it's good to have a paper that shows that it is possible, but because it is quite puzzling given the existing research, my main objective with this discussion is to try to find, effectively to serve a devil's advocate, to try to find what can explain the result beyond what is already in the paper. This slide just shows a brief summary of what the paper is doing. They're doing a survey experiment, very nicely constructed. There are several treatment groups. Some of them contain priming respondents with the hypothetical inflation rate for the current year. Some of them do not contain this priming. Some of them refer to the current regime, saying that this continues as it was up to now. Some of them introduce the new regime. So there are a number of treatments that can be compared one to another. And the first attempt to find what could be the reason for the result is to look at the probability mass that the authors obtain. This was shown in the slides as well. My version of the paper mentioned that it is expectations. I would rather call it probably distributions. But the main point is that the question contains 4 ranges, just below 1%, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and above 3%. The wording itself above 3% and finishing at that might, I'm saying might, it's not necessarily like that, but it might be a potential bias towards we don't believe that it will actually be above 3%. So if we want to claim that there is a shift upwards, maybe this is a good message, because we are not giving them a message that inflation expectations will be very high. But it would be good to see whether this wording and whether this clustering into 4 bins actually is helpful. In Quabion's paper, they find, for example, that 40% of respondents indicate inflation is likely to be above 5%. In this study, we find slightly different distribution. Would be interesting to see what explains to what extent this restriction of the answers to 4 categories is binding for the results, and to what extent it shapes the result. This is the chart from my own paper with Michael. This is the distribution. This is not the probability mass distribution. This is the distribution of frequencies with which our respondents give us different numbers of inflation. And the 4 ranges that the paper is talking about, they finish somewhere here. So from here and above, this is everything 5% and above. So this again indicates that there are many people who would want to give a reply which is above 5%, above 4%, but the estimates in the paper rather narrow the range. Again, I say that I'm trying to serve a devil's advocate. I'm trying to find what could be potential bias, but this bias is actually driving expectations down. So when we have the impact of the announcement to upwards, that means that despite containing expectations within a quite narrow range, we still observe the shift in there. Similarly, I was on this slide, I was just given the numbers of mean inflations and median inflation expectations from other papers. They are slightly higher than what the paper finds. Again, that might actually the version that I saw talked about anchoring. Having a very narrow range may have an impact for anchoring because you sort of shift, if you push your respondents towards telling you the answers from the middle of the range. But in terms of shifting expectations, maybe it is less restrictive. Then the other thing that I was thinking about what could be the reason, probably maybe the wording of the questions. The wording is and the briefing of respondents is slightly different from the Quabion's paper. I should apologize that here I give my own translation from German because the version of the paper that I saw gave a screenshot, and the newer version contains a better translation, which is also on the web page. But there is quite a difference between descriptions, or at least the way I perceived it, between the description of the inflation targeting regime and average inflation targeting regime. Again, I would look into that in the clean experiment. Perhaps it would be useful to have exactly the same style of explanation, pointing exactly in the same directions to avoid any biases. But if these biases exist, it would be good to see whether they play a role or not play a role, and have some discussion in that. Then with respect to treatments, there are so many treatments, but they are not, well, they are not all compared one to another. And I've tried to give some examples what could be done and what probably could shed more light on what is happening in the paper. The main result is that the mean inflation under average inflation targeting regime is greater than the mean inflation under inflation targeting regime, given that we had wording, and I assume that maybe the wording might bias respondents towards shifting the expectations upwards, unlike what the probability mass range does. I wonder what would it hold under different wording. Maybe just changing the wording in one of the ways would help answer this question. Then I very like the idea of priming respondents with the current inflation rate, because that gives you an asymmetric way to see what happens when you prime them. We are now in the low inflation rate, we are now in the high inflation rate regime. And there may be some simple predictions done with that. So for example, I would expect if we prime respondents by telling them that the current inflation is 3%, then exactly the wording of average inflation target can tell us that if inflation now overshoots the 2% target, then for some time the central bank will have to keep lower inflation than 2%. So inflation expectation should go down. But going through the table and doing some calculation, it looks to me, maybe I'm incorrect, but it looks to me from the calculation I've done that actually the priming with 3% shift expectations upwards. But does it stronger for inflation targeting than for average inflation targeting? So these are simple comparison that I would probably want to see in the paper explained, just to better understand what is going on there. Then I'm not going to discuss a lot of theory that is there. I thought that it's more about implications of what can be derived. I think I'm not quite sure about the consistency with the definition, what is one period, but Emanuel was not discussing it, so I'm not discussing it now as well. Generally, as I say, I like the paper, and I like the attempt to show that it is possible to steer expectations of consumers. And in our papers, we do a lot to find those expectations, but it is quite difficult to find those effects. And my attempt in this discussion was to find what could drive the effects in the design of the experiment. If some of my suggestions are valid, then perhaps controlling, I didn't quite get it from the presentation, whether the paper controls, the regressions don't contain controls for demographics. And as Lena has shown, as I also know from our papers, that when we control for demographics, sometimes effect become smaller. But the good message is, despite having a very limited range, the paper still shows that it is possible to steer expectations. So my main wish with this paper is just to understand the mechanism for that better and to remove all the possible critiques that I have presented in my slides from the paper, so that the paper gives a clean message that we all want communication matters.
Perfect. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump straight in. There's one question, Emanuel, I think you're aware of from Julian in the Q&A, but I'm also going to hand over Philippe first, and then Lora to throw in their questions on top, and then Lena.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Emanuel, for very insightful presentation. My question is, I agree with Dimitri that German households are not, should not be fundamentally different from, let's say, US household. But at the aggregate level, we know that there's probably some differences in their composition of their financial wealth, and maybe could be interesting to see whether this is what drives the difference between the lack of reaction to AIT that the Quavion et al. Document versus the fact that you seem to have some attention this type of strategy from German households, and maybe it's because they are more exposed to inflation risk, as we discussed a little bit before. The second just might be related to that. So maybe trust might also react to average inflation targeting, right? If German households are more, afraid of inflation risk, they might, decrease the trust in the central bank, and so it might, be a drawback of this transmission of this policy. Thanks.
Lora.
Yeah, so thanks for this. So I also want to join Dimitri in his question on what drives the difference between the Quavion et al. Results and yours. And what I'm wondering is whether it's really the setup of the experiment that basically causes the central bank's policy to be more salient in your case, Emanuel, than in Quavion and et al. Because I think, if I remember correctly, in Quavion's paper, basically they ask households whether they heard any announcements, and then conditional on whether people heard, do those expectations or do those news actually show up in their expectations? Whereas in your case, you're presenting them with a very salient change. So I wonder if it's this design that essentially renders one communication or one switch in policy salient versus the other not. And so whether that might be an interesting wedge to explore. But thanks, really, really interesting paper.
Okay, Lena.
Yes, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I was also very interested in your results regarding trust in the ECB. And I was wondering whether you checked if that relates also to more underlying psychological characteristics such as general optimism, pessimism, perhaps, or risk preferences, or things going in that direction.
So let me add on top of that, and I think this relates directly to also to what Philippe was saying. The other thing that certainly in the work I did with Andy when we first started looking at stuff like this, we found there's a really strong correlation between education levels, understanding of what central banks do, and what they declare as trust. Now, and the reason I'm mentioning Philippe's point is, of course, those things are also probably correlated with in most economies with financial wealth. So there's a whole nexus of things that really could be going on there. They could all be kind of interesting, but I do think it is interesting to add it in. Anyway, again, we're running short on time, so I hand over quickly the floor to you. And there's another question from Brent Meyer in the Q&A, but I'll leave you to answer that after the session, so we get on to Mirko's presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for the nice discussion and for the interesting questions. Let me address them very, very briefly. So Julian was asking whether the survey gives any idea on how long people expect average inflation returns to the target, to take to return to the targets. So we find that even the 5 to 10 year ahead inflation expectations are significantly higher under AIT. We can interpret this either as households thinking that 5 to 10 years is still the medium term as communicated by the central bank, or that they understand that basically then under such a strategy, the central bank wouldn't hit the zero lower bound as often, and so average inflation would be higher. I mean, I think it's a very benign and optimistic interpretation. I think they rather might have different views about what the medium term is. Addressing the comments by Dimitri, let me just briefly, so German households, and we've seen this and compared this to the New York Fed survey, for example, and other surveys, German households just know much more about inflation than US households. And let me just share my screen again. We also in the survey ask sort of point forecast for inflation, and we see that the mode is really strikingly at just below 2%. Almost a third of households think inflation is just below 2%. And there's very few who give extreme answers. Less than 6% have inflation above 12 or below minus 12%. And the mean of those point predictions is 2.4. The median is exactly 2%. So German households just know a lot about inflation. And whether that's due to different compositions in terms of sort of financial wealth that Philippe alluded to, I think we have to dig a bit deeper, but they do understand sort of inflation quite well, and they follow it quite closely. In terms of the formulation of the inflation aims, I agree that one could formulate things differently. What we intended is to really be as close as possible to the Fed's formulation of AIT and compare this to the current inflation targeting strategy that the ECB was following, of inflation close to but below 2%. And so we really wanted to understand if households would understand a shift to this alternative strategy as communicated by the Fed. I think there's many different ways to formulate such a strategy, and it would be interesting to see how households would react to different formulations. But that was not the scope of our analysis. We really wanted to see if communicated in the way the Fed did, would households understand it, and how would they understand it? We have to look into the priming, if sort of priming for in 2021 inflation to 3% shifts all expectations upwards. We haven't looked at that. We do have controls for demographics in many of our regressions, and I think Lora has already answered some of those questions in the chat. The differences to Coibien, I think, is really that inflation is more salient for German households. And so that's my take. But also, of course, many households don't follow central bank communication. So being presented with information about the central bank strategy probably makes them more aware, and so reacts more than just passively following this information. And now, I think our trust variable is very strongly correlated with education. I think we checked that, and it's not. And we also control for demographics in some of these regressions. So I think it's really, there's a dimension of trust that's unrelated to education and other things. But thank you so much for the very good comments, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just in the interest of time, we will hand straight over, Mirko, to you. And we will. You have the floor as soon as you are ready.
Just 1 second. Sorry, I'm having slide difficulties here. So I cannot do it full screen for some reason, so I keep it like this.
Okay.
So first of all, thanks to Michael for putting the paper on the program, and also the other organizers, of course, for putting the paper on the program. The paper is called The Effects of Forward Guidance, a Belief-Based Calibration Approach. And this is joint work with Chris Roth from the University of Cologne and Johannes Wohlfahrt from the University of Copenhagen. So the research question is, what are the effects of forward guidance? And what we do in this paper is that we propose a new method to address this question. And the key idea of the method is to do the following. So we measure agents' beliefs about the effects of monetary policy. So basically, we ask them about all the variables that are relevant for their, in the case of households, for their consumption decisions. What are your expectations about these variables under policy A? What are your expectations about these variables under policy B? And so thereby we get their subjective beliefs about the effects of moving from policy A to policy B. And then we move this, substitute these changes and expectations into the temporary equilibrium of a new Keynesian model. And so temporary equilibrium means these are the optimal decisions by households and firms for given beliefs. And so by substituting in the beliefs on the two alternative policies, we get the effect on, for example, consumption of moving from policy A to policy B. So that's the main idea. So let me illustrate that main idea with a very, very simple example. So take a very simple New Keynesian model. And this simple New Keynesian model really consists of two blocks of equations. The first block of equations are implied by optimal decisions for given expectations. So for example, the consumption-Euler equation is telling you what consumption is for given expectations. New Keynesian-Phillips curve is telling you what inflation is for given expectations, and you have the Taylor rule. So that's the temporary equilibrium of the New Keynesian model. So that these are outcomes for given expectations. And then you have a second block of equations that determine these expectations. For example, you assume rational expectations and complete information, and then you get a second block of information. You combine the two and you compute the equilibrium. Now, for a moment, just only think about consumption. So consumption is just a function of expected interest rate, expected inflation, expected future consumption. So if you're interested in consumption, the entire purpose of these other equations and this block down there is to tell you what these three expectations are on the two different policies, or under different policies. So what we do is, rather than taking this block down here and this block to substitute that into the equation up here, we use a survey and we elicit these expectations on the two different policies, and thereby we get the effect of the policy on consumption. So that's in a nutshell the idea of the paper in the context of that simple model. So that links, of course, to two sets of literatures. One set of literature that analyzes the effects of forward guidance using models. What's different here is that rather than substituting in the model implied expectations, we substitute in the expectations that we elicit from a survey for different policies. And then, of course, it's linked to the literature that elicits expectations from surveys. And the difference here is that we elicit all expectations that determine consumption according to a theory. And then we elicit all these expectations under two different policies. And thereby we can compute what is the effect of moving from policy 1 to policy B onto consumption. So now let me show you the main idea in the full model. So the full model that we use is quite a bit more complicated than the simple New Keynesian model. So we use a heterogeneous agent New Keynesian model with a borrowing constraint. So in particular, think of McKay, Nakamura, Steinson's AER 2016 paper. So this is a New Keynesian model, but on the household side, you have incomplete markets and the borrowing constraint. And then from that model, you get standard consumption savings decision with a borrowing constraint. So some households are borrowing constrained, they're hand-to-mouth households, and then other households are currently not borrowing constrained, but then they might believe that they might be borrowing constrained in the future. And so from then for each household, it depends on whether they're currently borrowing constrained or not, and that will give you the consumption function of these households. And so now what I want to show you is I want to show you the consumption function of a household in this model who is currently not borrowing constrained and also does not expect to be borrowing constrained in the future. And this is just one type of household in this model, but I want to illustrate, in the case of this particular household, I want to illustrate the main idea. So now let's write down the log-linearized consumption function of that household. And that log-linearized consumption function is obtained from the present value budget constraint, saying that the present value of consumption should equal the present value of income plus initial wealth. And then on the left-hand side, you have the present value of consumption, and you can collapse that all into a single current consumption by using the consumption-Euler equation. And so that's as usual. How do you derive the consumption function? You combine the present value budget constraint with the consumption Euler equation, and then it's telling you something very intuitive. It's telling you consumption depends on the expected discounted sum of current and future income. Just that comes from the right-hand side of the present value budget constraint. It's telling you that it depends on the expectation of nominal interest rates and inflation that's coming from substituting in the consumption Euler equation. And it's telling you that, that consumption also depends on your wealth, your initial wealth. And so notice that consumption is affected by policy, for example, forward guidance, only through these three expectations term. The expectations of your income path, the expectation of the interest rate and the inflation path, and the expectation of your wealth. So now if you're interested in the difference in consumption between two policies, what you do in a model, effectively what you solve that model, is you're just asking how do these expectations move according to the model in these two different policies, and then you compute the implied consumption. And so here we're going to replace the model implied expectation by survey measures of these expectations. So just to formalize that, just compute the difference of consumption in policy A, consumption policy B, that's what we call delta CIT. And that's just a function in the difference in expectations about your income path, your interest rate path, inflation path, and your wealth under these two policies. And so now what we do in the survey is we elicit all these different delta expectations that show up here in the lower part of the equation. So the survey was conducted as an online survey in early March, just before the FOMC meeting in mid-March. There were about 2,000 respondents. They are representative of the US population in terms of education, gender, age, region, and household net income. And then the structure of the survey is the following. We first collect some demographics. Then we define some terms, we define the policy rate, we define inflation, and then we confront people with a baseline scenario, and then we ask, what are your expectations under this baseline scenario about all the variables that you just saw in the consumption function? And then we go to an alternative scenario, and we tell people, well, now suppose that the policy announcement is a different one, and again, we elicit the exact same expectations, and from these differences, we compute all the delta expectations that you saw in the equation before. And then we substitute that into the consumption function, but households have different consumption function depending on whether they're borrowing constrained. So we need to elicit whether people are borrowing constrained, and also depending on what their subjective beliefs are of being borrowing constrained in the future. Remember the McKay, Nakamura, Steinson insight that if you think to be borrowing constrained in the future, then your consumption function looks different. It puts more weight on things that are in the near future. So at the end of the survey, we elicit for example, the liquid asset position of the agents, their revolving credit card debt, in order to identify the hand-to-mouth status, to know which consumption function to substitute it into, and we also elicit their subjective beliefs about being borrowing constrained in the future. And then we simply compute the delta consumption for each individual household. We aggregate that up, and that's according to the combination of the theory and the survey, the effect of moving from policy A to policy B on consumption. So then let me show you how the baseline scenario is presented. It's saying we now would like to ask you to imagine the following scenario. Please imagine that at the next meeting of the Fed in a few days, the Fed announces that the current federal funds rate will remain unchanged, and also the Fed announces that its projections about the future federal funds rate at the end of 2023 remains unchanged. And also further note that the projections about the 2030 federal funds rate remain unchanged. Imagine that you hear this the day after the meeting, and now tell us what your expectations are about your own income path, your interest rate, the interest rate path, the inflation path, and potentially also about the value of your assets. So then these expectations are elicited. Then we move to an alternative scenario, and the only difference in the scenario is the one about the Fed's projection about the interest rate at the end of 2023. So please imagine that at the next meeting, March 2016-17, the Fed again announces that current federal funds rate will remain unchanged, but now imagine that different to the scenario that you saw before, the Fed actually announces that its projections about the future federal funds rate has moved up, in 2023 has moved up from 0.1% to 0.5%, so 40 basis point increase. And then people are asked again, what are now your expectations about your nominal income path, about the interest rate inflation, and so on. And here, when we present people the alternative treatment, we cross-randomize. We give no explanation for why the Fed changed its projection. We give an explanation which is justified by changes in economic conditions, and we give an explanation which is thought of as a monetary policy shock. Imagine that the composition of the FOMC has changed, and therefore the projection of the FOMC members has changed. So we wanted to know whether it matters. This is just as a robustness check, that what justification was given for this change in the projection of the federal funds rate. So now let me show you what the differences in these expectations are. So first of all, this is the federal funds rate, the expected federal funds rate path. So we asked people about the expectation of the federal funds rate at the end of 2021, 2022, 23, 26, and 30. We do that under the two policies. So we have the delta, so the difference in expectations across these two policies for each of these different points in time, for each individual households. And now let me average across all households, and that's what you see in this table. And so what you see is that under the alternative policy scenario, people are saying, we do expect interest rates to be higher at the end of 2023. So the Fed's projection moved up by 40 basis points. Agents' expectation of the interest rate at that point in time moved up by 20 basis points. So they to some extent expected now higher interest rates. They also expected to some extent higher interest rates already before. So this seems to say that when they're confronted with the Fed expecting higher interest rates in the future, they're saying, well, probably that also means that they might already raise interest rates earlier already. And so you see to some extent also the interest rate expectations about nearby policy rates already moving up, but to a lesser extent. So forward guidance affects households' policy rate expectations at different horizons. Then the same with inflation. So we asked people about the inflation expectation 2021, 2022, 23, and an average of these 3 years. Again, for each household, we have the difference in these two expectations for paths for these two different policies. We average across whole households, and here you see what happens is that under this alternative policy scenario, on average, people have lower inflation expectations. So they seem to think that these higher interest rates somehow are somehow linked to lower inflation. And interestingly, the peak effect on inflation that people expect happens in the year 2021, and then to a lesser extent in 2022, and then to a lesser extent later on. So people think that the peak effect of forward guidance on inflation seems to happen on when the announcement occurs. So forward guidance moderately affects households' inflation expectations. And in terms of magnitude, keep in mind they're confronted with a 40 basis points higher interest rate projection in 2023, and they reduced their inflation expectations by 25 basis points in 2021. So somewhat smaller than the projected increase in the interest rate that occurs in the future. And we write this as being moderate because this is much smaller than what most models predict. Now, keep in mind that in most models you have this accumulative effect, and therefore the effect on initial inflation is really quite large. And so we find a significant effect, and in fact the peak effect on impact, but it's moderate. And then we go to the last term, or one of the other terms that showed up in the consumption function, and that is their own income expectations. And what we find is that people don't adjust the expectations of their own nominal income at any horizon. So this is, again, for each household, we ask them, what do you think is going to be your own income in 2021, in the following 2 years, and then over this 3-year period? Again, give that answer under the no change scenario, give that answer under the scenario that the Fed announces a higher or expects a higher interest rate at the end of 2023. And while people adjusted their interest rate expectations, adjusted their inflation expectations, on average, they just don't adjust their own income expectations at all. So think of you as working, at a central bank or at a university. You have some nominal income. This is some number, and now you're confronted with that policy B, and you're just thinking, that's probably the same income that I have under policy A. So somehow you think that this is going to affect interest rates and inflation, but you just don't think that this affects your own nominal income. So forward guidance has no effect on expectations of own nominal income at any horizon. So now we take this data and we substitute it into the consumption function for each household, and we aggregate up. And notice that there were only two remaining parameters that showed up in the consumption function. One is the discount factor. And so we set it to a quarterly discount factor of 0.99. And the other one is the rate of intertemporal substitution, and we set it to 1/2. That governs the strength of the intertemporal substitution effect. We here assume that, or the calculation that we're doing here is assume that all households hear this forward guidance announcement, just like the design of our survey is. So of course, some households might not hear, and thereby the effects might be stronger, but we're interested in what would happen if actually all households now heard this announcement, adjusted their expectations the way they're telling us they would adjust their expectations, and then what kind of consumption responses are we getting from the consumption function. Ignore this term for sentence for a second, I'll explain that later. So then substituting that into each agent's subjective beliefs into her consumption function, right? And remember, we also elicit whether people are hand to mouth or not, and so on, to substitute their beliefs into their respective consumption function. We get the following effect on aggregate consumption. So first of all, we have, broadly speaking, three types of households. Let me focus on this type. So these are the households who, according to their wealth answers, the answers on liquid wealth and the answers on their revolving credit card debt, are, according to our classification, not hand to mouth. They're not borrowing constrained. They have not enough liquid wealth, positive, or maybe they have some credit card debt, but their credit card debt is far away from the credit card limit that they're telling us. So we consider them not to be borrowing constrained. And also, when we elicit their subjective beliefs about being borrowing constrained in the future, they're telling us we don't expect to be borrowing constrained in the future. So then we take the consumption function that I showed you before, and we substituted in these delta expectations for these households into the consumption function that I showed you before. That gives one number per households. We aggregate up across all these households, and this is what we get. So this is saying, according to the expected adjustments of their path, this forward guidance announcement reduces the consumption of these non-hand-to-mouth households who don't expect to be borrowing constrained in the future by about 0.5 percentage points. Then we take the households who are also not borrowing constrained, but who are telling us that they believe to be borrowing constrained in the future with a certain probability. And here we use a consumption function that puts more weight on nearby events. And then for these, the effects are smaller because the consumption function is smaller, is different, but also because they have different expectations, as it turns out. And then you have the final class of households, which are the households we classify as hand to mouth. For them, expectations don't matter for their consumption decisions because they're hand to mouth. And then you have to take and make a decision, an assumption whether you basically let this Keynesian cross operate, whether this consumption response now translates into income, changes the income of the hand-to-mouth households, and thereby changes their consumption. Here in the Stott experiment, we set that to 0 because we think that these hand-to-mouth households probably would get changes in income at some later point in time. So for example, firms responding to this change in consumption and therefore be demand and a change in inventories, that just changes profits, and that profit is eventually redistributed to households, but that happens at a later point in time. So on impact, this effect is likely to be small. And so, of course, just like in a model, you make assumptions whether this Keynesian cross operates immediately or not. Here we can just do this calculation under the assumption that this effect operates immediately or not. And here we say it's this is the particular calculation when we say this Keynesian cross effects operates later on. And so what we find is that overall, based on this data and based on the consumption functions that we get from this heterogeneous Asian New Keynesian model, we find that the Fed's announcement that the projection about the interest rate at the end of 2023 has changed, in particular that projection has moved up by 40 basis points, reduces aggregate consumption by 20 basis points. And then we do a kind of a set of robustness effects. So first of all, robustness of effects on expectations. We give different reasons for why this policy change has happened, and we don't find differences across these different treatments. We also thought, well, maybe when this announcement happens, they would see some other variables moving, like, for example, the stock market. So we told them that simultaneously the stock market is moving, it's going up by 1%. and we didn't find any changes in their expected path when we introduced that treatment. And then, of course, you can put these expectations into a different consumption function. So, for example, you could put in, take a Gabet-style consumption function where you put in some extra discounting or so on. And this is just to clearly separate what comes from expectations and what comes from consumption function. But notice already at this consumption function, which are the very standard ones, these effects are modest, and most of these other consumption functions are designed to yield even smaller effects. So you're going to get kind of even smaller effects there. And then this is something that goes more into the details, but in principle, what shows up in the consumption function is the entire path, and we only elicited expectations over certain intervals. But given that the discount rate is close to 1, it's 0.99, it doesn't really matter whether your income occurs, a year later or a year earlier, but we did some variation across that line as well. And so just to conclude, we ask what are the effects of policy announcements in general, and here forward guidance in particular. And to address this question, we propose a new method. So we suggest to use this temporary equilibrium concept. So you just take your standard equations, which are telling you what are actions for given beliefs, and then rather than substituting in the model implied beliefs, substitute in the measured beliefs from a survey. And since we're getting at the effects of policy, we have to measure these beliefs under the different policies to get at the effects of policies. And so from a kind of survey perspective, what's new is that we elicit all the expectations that show up in the consumption function, and in fact different consumption functions, because we have these different types of households. And then we elicit these expectations under 2 different policies. And what we find is forward guidance has modest effects because households believe that it has modest effects, and especially on their own nominal income.
Perfect. Thanks, Mirko. Lora, hand over to you. I'm not sure whether you're at the ECB yet or you're still with a Boston affiliation. I know you're physically in Boston, but
yeah, I'm still at BC right
okay.
now. I'll be joining the ECB soon.
Okay, so no disclaimer until then.
Yeah, no disclaimer yet.
Okay. I'm very nervous by 50 slides, given how tight time is.
Oh no, and I have 10 slides or 9.
Okay. Carry on.
So thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me to discuss this paper. So let me get right into it. So before giving a quick summary of what the authors do, I want to back up for a second and just think about a very general question that I think about a lot, and that is definitely, I think, at the back of the minds of the authors as well. So just think of, a very general setup in which there is some variable y that depends on expectations of another variable x, and that other variable x is a function of some other variable c. In particular, what I have in mind here is an economic model where y is an outcome variable. So for example, consumption, as in this paper. And then x is some endogenous variable or a set of endogenous variables. And z is some exogenous innovation. For example, forward guidance, where the central bank tells something about the future path of interest rates. Okay, and then if we want to get at how the exogenous innovation affects the outcome variable, so how does forward guidance affect consumption, then we essentially need to use something like a chain rule to get at that effect. So the change in monetary policy communication, that effect on consumption has to go through 2 things. One is how outcome variables, so consumption, respond to expectations. That's the first part. And then the second part is how expectations respond to shocks. And so what the authors are tackling here is really the issue that whereas our models are fairly consistent on how we think outcome variables respond to expectations, this other derivative, the response of expectations to shocks, is not robust to different kinds of models. So you could have rational expectations or a wide variety of bounded rationality or whatever. This derivative will be different depending on models. And so the author's proposition is to use data to calibrate this and then just obtain the first expectation from a standard heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model. Okay, so that's really the approach that they take. Okay, so let me recap that. So we have a standard macro model. It's a heterogeneous agent new Keynesian model without a specification for the expectations process. And as I just said, what this does is it gives us a model for the first derivative, so the derivative of outcome variables with respect to expectations, but it allows us to be agnostic about how expectations respond to a forward guidance shock. Okay, and then we have model implied effects of forward guidance given changes in expectations. We can back out the changes in expectations from survey data, as the authors do, plug those back into the model, and that way we can compute the effect of forward guidance. So that's exactly the approach that they take. And so in their model, they derive different consumption functions for different parts of the population. So changes in consumption for an individual at a certain point in time are functions of their expectations of their real permanent income. So this stream of real income, expectations of real interest rates, and real wealth, so real initial wealth, as Mirko showed us. And as Mirko also alluded to, this F function is different for three groups of households that they consider. One is the hand-to-mouth. The second is the non-hand-to-mouth, who believe never to be credit constrained in the future. And the non-hand-to-mouth, who consider there to be a positive probability of being constrained in the future. Okay, and the way that expectations are elicited is by this experiment where I'll be a little brief. So there is a baseline scenario that is initially given to households. This is just my paraphrasing, where basically they're asked to imagine that at the next meeting, the Fed announces to project to keep the Fed funds rate constant through 2023. And then there's a rise scenario in which the households are asked to imagine that the Fed projects to raise the Fed funds rate actually by 4 percentage points, 0.4 percentage points, not 5, at the end of 2023. And so the change in expectations is backed out as the difference in expectations between this rise and baseline scenario. Okay, and so again, this is a typo. This should be 0.4 percentage point increase in the Fed funds rate, as Mirko showed us. This gives rise to a hump-shaped response in the expectations of the federal funds rate. Initially, there's a very modest increase in 2021. The peak increase is sizable, but about half of what the Fed projection was. We get the right sign for expected inflation. It goes down, but it peaks already in 2021, and we have a 0.25 percentage points decrease. Somewhat surprising is that there's no effect on nominal income expectations, as Mirko noted, which means that households are effectively thinking that their real income will go up. But the aggregation exercise that Mirko and his co-authors do gives us an estimate that in response to a 40 basis point increase in the federal funds rate, when you take all the different expectation changes and the consumption elasticities into account, you get that aggregate consumption falls by about 0.2 percentage points. Okay, and where this number comes from, as Mirko showed us, it comes from aggregating through the different kinds of households, the hand-to-mouth, the non-hand-to-mouth, who believe they will be never constrained, or the ones who think that there's a positive probability that they will be credit constrained in the future. You plug in their expectation changes and what individual change in consumption that implies, and that's where this number comes from. Okay, so let me turn to the comments. I'm just going to give a big picture set of comments here, and then I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of these comments. So first of all, very relevant topic. We wouldn't be here if we didn't all agree. I think the approach is really creative, and I'll talk a little more about that in a second. And I think the data work, is as careful as you can make it. So these are all pluses in my point of view. What I missed a little bit is more of a discussion of big picture implications. So I think that I'll talk a little more about this, but basically we get this result of about a 0.2 percentage point decrease in consumption. I would have liked to dig a little deeper, and I'll say a little more about that in a second. Then I do wonder whether this will be our last word on the effects of forward guidance. And I'll talk a little more about this in a second as well, but I'm just going to throw it out there that, you know, there's more about general equilibrium and theories of expectations in the background that I think we could dig deeper into, and we could, you know, give more conclusive stuff. So let me say more stuff about these points. So my main point, which is the biggest strength and why I really like this paper, is this idea that it's agnostic on expectation formation. That's what I designated as a really creative approach. So I mentioned in the very beginning that there is this problem that how expectations respond to exogenous shocks really depends on the model. So you can have rational expectations, or you can have what has been often called the wilderness of bounded rationality, in which, you know, you can entertain a bunch of different alternatives, such as rational inattention, in which Mirko has worked, sparse optimization a la Gabet, diagnostic expectations a la Bordalo et al., adaptive expectations a la Eusebio, Preston, and co-authors such as Emanuel, or anchored expectations, in which Emanuel and myself have worked. So there are, you know, a bunch of alternatives out there, and, you know, the problem is that this derivative, the reaction of expectations to exogenous stuff, is really not robust to whichever alternative you entertain. So, you know, if you're after what's the effect of forward guidance, well, it really depends on what model of expectations you entertain. And so I really like this approach to say, well, you know what, let's not entertain any model of expectation information, let data speak to it. Maybe that can give us a conclusive answer. Let me note very briefly that there's a paper that I think is very related here. It's Charor and Gerardo, the expectations response function, which is, I think, after a very similar question. It's after being agnostic about the expectation formation, deriving model implications. And they actually have a forward guidance exercise there as well. So I just wanted to point that out. So I really like this approach. I think it's a very promising approach. But my feeling is, can we do more with this? And that's where my critiques, or whatever you want to call it, come in. So the first one is, what does the number, so this is the decrease in consumption after a 40 basis point increase in the federal funds rate, the communicated federal funds rate. What does this number actually mean? Is this big or small? So Mirko noted that it seems modest. I'm not sure if I agree. I mean, given that you have a lot of hand-to-mouth households and you know, modest responsive expectations, it seems relatively big, but you know, maybe it's not. I'm also wondering whether it's asymmetric. So if, you know, if the federal funds rate were to decrease instead of increase, would this number change? It might, given that we have a lot of evidence that expectations may be asymmetric, including in my work. So that would be very interesting to discuss. What are the big picture implications of this number? Also, what's the role of the horizon? So that the forward guidance here was, I think, you know, 2 years in advance. Would different horizons matter? Then the other thing about, is this the last word on forward guidance? I'm missing a little bit. The reason I kind of lean toward no is because I'm missing a little bit, you know, firms from this story and general equilibrium. So Mirko mentioned it a little bit with the Keynesian cross assumption, that kind of takes care of the general equilibrium implications. But what is the role of firms' expectations here, and how they interact with what firms do and how that spills back onto households? It would be interesting. You know, I imagine that you probably cannot do that from the data that you have, but it would be interesting to discuss what that would mean. And so, you know, lastly, and this is just a personal preference of mine, I think that your approach, as hinted at the very beginning of the discussion, enables us to answer very big picture questions about those elasticities of expectations with respect to shocks. it can possibly, help us learn more about what are the theories of expectation formation that are more close to what's actually out there. So I'm really curious, can we actually use your approach to validate some of these theories or to reject some other theories? So my big question there is, can we do more with this? And I couldn't resist. I have to say, my hunch is yes, we can. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Lora. I know we've every single individual overshot. So my prediction that we would all be undershooting thanks to the Germanic presence was a cultural bias that was unfairly imposed on our speakers. Philippe, I'll come to you in just a second, or if any other questions come in, but let me also just say, give my own reaction, which I want to agree with Lora. I think this is like super interesting and super creative. I find it really nice. But I also want to say thank you to Lora, because the way you explained it on your first slide, I don't know if that's in their paper, but I found that really clear. And I think it's a super way. And Mirko, if you and Johannes and Chris are not nicking that, you should. With full attribution to Lora. It was as a descriptor of what's happening, it really was beautiful. Thank you. Anyway, Philippe.
Yeah, thanks both for the presentation and the discussion. Both were excellent. So the results are really striking, and you might want to compare them with also the Pavlova papers, where they show that not every type of forward-guidance announcements matter. And so it seems here that you have a relatively small announcement that matters when it comes to inflation expectation, but not so much when it comes to consumption decision, because of this lack of reaction of income. And I think it would be interesting to compare the two. And related to that, I guess it will take another several rounds. But if you were to do a larger forward guidance announcement, would you expect something different? Maybe there's threshold. In the form of, so maybe you're going to have, some form of non-linearity and bigger impact if you consider larger announcements.
Okay. Emanuel?
Just in case you do another survey around Merkel, it would be interesting to see how individuals expect their consumption to change. I mean, that's easy enough to ask, and it would be interesting to sort of contrast this with the model implied consumption paths. And it's, I don't know what you would learn from this necessarily. It remains to be thought about, but it could be interesting.
Yeah, if I can just, I'll hand over to you again, Mirko, for the last word as usual. But one thing that struck me as well is, you have these elicited expectational changes. They're similar in a lot of different models. I guess you could similarly, you could create your own robust estimates of things with different models to see, what if you treat the hand-to-mouth consumers differently, and what if they, what if they're misguided in their beliefs about that? I again, a bit like Emanuel, I'm not exactly sure what we learned from that directly, but I still think it would be an interesting dimension to this approach. Anyway, let me hand over to you for final word.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Laura, for the discussion. And especially for the beautiful summary of the paper. And that's exactly how we thought about it. Exactly. So that's like what you described it super well. And it was probably not so easy to infer from the paper how it's written up, but that's exactly how we thought about it. That's exactly how we came up with the idea of doing that, and exactly the motivation you described. Let me get at some of the comments. Would it matter whether the forward guidance is in a different direction, what the horizon of forward guidance is? What we're really trying to do is a methodology, and we would encourage central banks, or the idea is that central banks basically can run that before every FOMC meeting, so the idea is basically that you do that 2 weeks before. You have, let's say, 2 policies on the table. You run the survey. You get the expectation changes for these two policies, and then you can compute before the meeting and in the current state of the world, under the current debates that are happening, how expectations would move. That's the idea. And so that's, we think, is also a strength, that these things might be state contingent. They might depend on the precise policies, and you can you don't have to rely on past data or models that are fit to something else to do that. You can do that for the current context. And so, so yes, we think this might be asymmetric. It might depend on the horizon, but the method can deal with it because you can do that before the meeting. And then regarding firms and GE, keep in mind, again, the temporary equilibrium concept. So you're moving to the next period. The consumption functions are the same. It's just expectations move. And so the question is, what do people learn in the meantime? And so what we thought is what one could do is that you put this as the initial point into a learning model, and then you could let the economy run. And we know something how, for example, from Courbet and Goethe work, how people update their beliefs when they see inflation and so on. And you could, in principle, just then let the economy run. That's how we think about this. And so GE is in here because GE is in expectations. But it's more that the question is, how do expectations move in the following period when households see more? And we think they won't see much in the near future because most things are released later, like inflation data, consumption data, and so on. And notice also that data is generated by these small consumption responses in the first place. So they're not going to see something dramatic different, but you could now use a model to compute the following periods. And then we try to stay away from theories of expectation formation, but of course, I also found some of these results quite striking. And I think what's quite important is this about not nominal income expectations not changing. And I haven't seen that anywhere in any theory, but basically this is that people think their own income doesn't load much on an aggregate factor. And of course you can formalize that, solve such a model, and I think would be interesting. And so, yeah, so this could also be encourage more work on expectation formation. Yeah, and thanks so much for the discussion and all the comments.
Okay, excellent. Right, we have managed to irk out an extra 10% out of every speaker, so thank you to everybody. Let me, on behalf of the CEPR, thank CEBRA for putting this great conference on, and for us, you know, all the speakers and discussants and everyone who attended for coming. It was fantastic. This is a topic which, you know, in all of our models, you know, people, real, you know, the agents in our models are the core actors, and they cause all this stuff to happen. And increasingly now policy institutions are thinking about how their expectations are formed, how they react to announcements, how they react to communication. And that's what we were trying to get at today. And all three papers absolutely hit the spot for me. So thank you all. And yeah, I wish you all a nice Friday evening, nighttime if you're in Russia, Dimitri, afternoon for those in Boston and the rest of the world, and to those of us in Europe, a nice Friday evening. Okay, thanks very much to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.